speaker is Rabia. We're going to talk about just transition financing mechanism. Masimezi, manabe mans.
So, in a relationship and Earthlife Africa, so I'm telling you, so why am I still on your team? We feel left out. So, other girls will be in seminars. So, next time, I guess I was another post, so figure it right. So, Nyabonga, some getting as I think to me, and Umlan Ubala, and Umlan Ubona. Abantu besifazane bebungene njengoba indlela esaphothana ngayo nje isangayo uthando into enhle esibonayo ze-Rabia Transitions. So angithi kuba bonke bengithi sizozithula kumina namhlanje sibonge ngethuba sibonge futhi ngendlela enisamukele ngayo. So namhlanje angihambi ngiyedwa igama lami uZandile kwaMchunu ngihamba nama-colleagues ami u-Patrick Mayhem no Yasmin Yearhomes. So Patrick no Yasmin bakuyi-research team bangama-research analysts e-Rabia ibona abenza ucwaningo noma uphando ngezinto ezihlanganene ne-just transitions. Hamba nanomphathi wethu wakhona la e-PE u-Dr. Chantal Naidu. So kumnandi ukubona i-community yase-PE ngendlela nje ebambene ngayo and siyabonga ukuthi nisamukele eGqeberha. So just nje ukungadelay presentation yama-colleagues ami sizobe sisiza nge-translation lapho nalapho sibona ukuthi asisazwani khona. Siyabonga kakhulu.
How are you? So I am Yasmin Mirals. I'm an economist and I have a background in infrastructure, socio-economic impact and financial flows, and I've been working and part of the Rabia team for just over a year now. So today, myself and my colleague are going to provide a bit of information for you on the just transition financing mechanism. Just so you have an overview of kind of what we're going to speak about, first we're going to look at the stakeholders and challenges of the transition, then we're going to look at the required response measures, then how South Africa plans to finance the response, the just transition financing mechanism, and then the ways forward. Next slide, please. We've come here today to outline the challenges arising from the South African just energy transition and what the just transition financing mechanism, or the JTFM, is. And through this, we hope to leave you with the understanding of how the JTFM is relevant to you and your communities, empowering you to engage and comment on the JTFM, and giving you the knowledge to advocate and make sure the JTFM is appropriate for you and your communities. And next slide, please. Next slide, please. So why should South Africa transition? The first thing that's important to understand when it comes to a just transition is why South Africa specifically needs to transition. There are three key reasons for this. The first reason is that South Africa is the highest carbon emitter in Africa. South Africa is a coal-based economy with 90% of our energy coming from burning coal, with Eskom and Sasol being the highest emitters in the country. Even though burning coal is bad for the environment, the problem is that the coal industry creates a lot of jobs and is one of the highest employers in the country. The second reason for a transition is severe climate impacts. climate change impacts all members of society, and I'm sure everyone in this room is very aware of the sorts of things that happen with climate change, like droughts, floods, and heat waves, which can cause job loss, destroying roads and houses, biodiversity loss, and health impacts. The last reason why South Africa should transition is due to international NDC commitments. Many countries in the world have committed to lowering their carbon emissions to help prevent global warming from reaching a more destructive level. Next slide, please, Andy. We will now look at who will be affected by the just transition. This list is a summary, and it is important to note that there are other affected stakeholders. But some of the people in our society that are impacted by the just energy transition are workers, communities, the environment, the government, the private sector, informal business, municipalities, and vulnerable groups, including women, the elderly, and youth. In order to make sure that the just transition is fair and equitable, we need to make sure that we understand how all these stakeholders are impacted by the transition and the needs of the stakeholders are considered. Everyone affected by the transition from a carbon-intensive economy to a green economy has rights that must be acknowledged and respected. Next slide, please. One of the biggest hurdles in transitioning is finding balance between people, the environment, and the economy. Because everyone involved in the transition has rights and interests, we need to make sure that no one is being unfairly disadvantaged. Transition is not just about switching from one energy source to another. It's about balancing the rights and needs of diverse groups across our society. We need to balance socio-economic rights, which include the right to work, the right to education and skills development, the right to affordable energy, the right to land use, and the right to cultural preservation. We also need to consider environmental rights, such as the right to a healthy environment, environmental protection, national emissions reduction targets, biodiversity conservation, decarbonization, and also the economic responsibilities, such as economic development, energy prices, economic stability, renewable energy development, intergenerational equity, energy security, and grid expansion. There are many meetings happening globally and locally around the just transition, what it will take and how it needs to be coordinated. There are also many plans and policies already in place by the government in South Africa. As you can see on the right-hand side of this slide, one of the plans is the JTFM, which will be discussed in more detail later on in this presentation. The just transition, moving from plans to actions is vital. The just transition framework says that social partners in South Africa will need to design their own policies and programs in line with the specific conditions, responsibilities, and realms of influence based on the visions, principles, and interventions articulated in this framework. There are many players in the just transition space and many actors. The image on the left shows just the civil society, NGOs, and CBOs that are active in the South African just transition space. What needs to be considered here is that there is a greater web of all different players in South Africa. Whose responsibility is the transition? What does each actor do? And what is the role of civil society in this setting? It is important here that civil society has a solid understanding of the gaps and weaknesses in their role, and having clarity in what civil society needs to do and how to do it. Civil society needs to be keeping pressure on plans for new investments and on the just transition. Next slide. There are two main branches of what needs to be funded in the just energy transition. The first is purely transitional elements. This includes infrastructure and technology challenges that move South Africa away from coal and towards green energy. These are things such as solar panels, solar plants, electric vehicles, and grid expansion. The next branch of funding needs to be done on social or justice elements. These elements make sure that people are not harmed in the just transition, particularly people who are economically vulnerable. These elements are things like preventing increased unemployment, social relief grants, and upskilling and reskilling people to prevent job loss. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Patrick to discuss the JTFM. Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Patrick Leland. I think I met some of you before last year in PE, but also online in some workshops. I'd just firstly like to thank all of you for inviting us here today. It's also an honor to be in a room full of such strong women who are clearly making an impact in the struggle for just transition. Also, thank you to Dr. Boucher for a reminder of many of the women who had to lose their lives in the struggle for an environmentally just world. So I think it's fair to give you all a round of applause for the space and also the just transition finance mechanism. Next slide, please. Yeah, next slide, thank you. So, with a clearer understanding of the transition space in South Africa, which Yasmin has discussed, the next question, the next logical question is, what are the plans to fund the elements such as social protection and skills development, and how much finance is actually needed? So before I discuss this, I just want to take a step back and say, within the broader financial space of South Africa, there are several sources of finance and plans at play that can be used to support the transition and are also being used. On the slides here, I've just highlighted a few elements. But just to mention a few, you have public finance. So this is finance mobilized through public budgets, so Department of Social Development, Department of Energy. And this funding can directly go towards initiatives such as renewable energy development, social protection program, and employment benefits and reskilling initiatives. You also have private finance, which has largely been flowing towards the renewable energy independent power producer program, which has attracted almost 113 billion in private sector investment since the early 2010s. More directly linked to the JTFM and also the Just Transition, you have things like the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to touch on the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan briefly because it does link to the JTFM, and I'll explain why in a bit. So the JIP, so the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, is a strategic investment framework which was developed by the Climate Finance Task Team within the presidency in coordination with the IPG partners. So if any of you don't know, IPG partners are the international group of donor countries who have agreed to support South Africa in the Just Transition. So as I said, the JIP was developed as part of the JP process and outlines the initial finance and investment that is required for just transition in South Africa, covering the period 2023 to 2027. Now, as I said, this is just an initial amount. So according to the JTFM, for this period, 1.48 trillion rand will be needed. So that, I mean, that's a lot of money. But it still is only the initial amount that is needed. And this will be used to support the development of South Africa's renewable energy sector, new energy vehicles, so in places like the Eastern Cape, obviously they're transitioning from like petrol cars, they'll need to transition to electric vehicles, to support the development of green hydrogen. And it also outlines the initial investment that will be needed for skills development, to support municipalities, and for social protection, all of which are essential for the region. So, although the JIP outlines various sources of potential funding, and 98 billion rand has been committed by the IPG partners, there are still large funding gaps. So one of the steps that has been taken to address this gap and sort of get the JIP process going is that the presidency has established the JET project management unit to drive the JIP implementation plan. One of the priorities of this project management unit has been the establishment of a funding platform. So the idea behind this funding platform is that it will provide project preparation support, and we'll also engage in matchmaking, something I'll explain in a bit later. The reason I'm mentioning this is because the PMU and the PCC, which is sort of driving the JTFM, have had extensive engagements to ensure that there's close alignment between the two mechanisms, and that lessons and insights from the funding platform inform how the JTFM develops. With the idea being that the JTFM will potentially evolve out of the funding platform itself of the PMU. Next slide, please. Thank you. So with this as a basis, I'll now present what the JTFM is about. But again, I first want to outline the background to the JTFM. So the initial draft of the JTFM was commissioned by the Presidential Climate Commission and was prepared by Crothan, a research company. This was published last year, November, and the public had an opportunity to comment on this draft. And I know certain people here might have engaged in this process. Since then, the Presidential Climate Commission has published a recommendations report on the JTFM, where they claim at least certain stakeholder comments have been included. So just to touch on the primary aim of the JTFM, this is to raise and channel funds towards a just transition and provide support to enable bottom-up responses to the just transition and facilitate the development and successful implementation of just transition projects. The key funding priorities of the JTFM are workforce development and skills training, economic diversification, sustainable agriculture, clean energy and infrastructure, social protection, community engagement and environmental protection, and innovation and capacity building. As I said earlier, it is intended to be aligned with the PMU and relates, but it is also important to note it is still in its conceptual phase. It isn't a finalized document. What has come out are purely, simply recommendations from the PCC. Next slide, please. So within the JTFM document, and based on the barriers that have been identified, the JTFM, there have been 6 key functions that have been identified for the JTFM and roles that it should fulfill. The first is matchmaking. So the idea behind matchmaking is that what you want to do is you want to link funders with particular projects. Because there's money on the one side, but there's also potential just transition projects on the other side, and there needs to be a mechanism. Well, the idea is that a matchmaking mechanism be put in place to link the two. Then you have fund mobilization and aggregation. So really mobilizing as much funding as you can and getting it together so that you can allocate it to different projects. Then you have blending and structuring of financial instruments. This is very similar to fund mobilization and aggregation, but really what it is you're combining grants and other forms of finance together so that you have more money that you can then allocate towards projects. Then you have applying a standardized project assessment framework, which includes tagging. So the idea behind tagging is that you're providing a framework and a methodology to assess projects as being relevant to the just transition. The reason that this is important is because if I claim to have a just transition project and I go to, let's say, the JTFM, for example, and I say this is a just transition project, there needs to be a way to determine, is this project actually just? And by developing a tagging framework, you can say you have to tick certain boxes in order for the project to qualify as just. In the initial draft, the tagging framework was divided into 4 main categories. So there was climate impact, there was transitioning in, so for example, new emerging industries, and transitioning out, so moving away from coal. Finally, there was the 4th category, which is about economic development and social development. So those are the 4 main categories for the tagging framework. I just want to add here, because this section does get quite technical. If you have any questions, please note them down, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have. The other 2 key functions of the JTFM that have been outlined are project preparation, supporting projects through each stage of their development process, from conceptualization until execution. And then finally, facilitating collaboration. So facilitating collaboration and building the capacity of stakeholders, communities, municipalities. However, not much detail is given in the recommendations report or the draft and what this would actually entail. One thing I also do want to mention is that in the draft, it is stated that the JTFM would initially focus on matchmaking and tagging, but over time this will evolve into project development, capacity building, and finance structuring functions. Next slide, please. So in terms of the funding sources outlined in the draft report and the more recent recommendations report, you have three main funding sources identified. This is grant funding. So grant funding is non-repayable financial support. One of the reasons this has been emphasized in the JTFM is because many of the initiatives that are crucial to a just transition, especially things like social protection, skills development, and community-based renewable energy, are not necessarily profitable. So they do not generate revenue and cannot necessarily attract the amount of, or they cannot necessarily attract private sector investment, hence the focus on grant funding. There's also, what's also mentioned quite a bit is blended finance, something I mentioned earlier. But the idea behind blended finance is combining different types of funding. So you're taking grant funding, you're taking private sector funding, maybe you're also taking some government funding, and you're combining it so that you have a larger pool of funding that can go towards specific projects. And what it also does is it allows private capital to be combined with capital that does not necessarily, that doesn't have to be paid back. Then there's also private finance, which is emphasized quite a bit. However, private finance, and this is stated in the JTFM, this will most typically go towards bankable transition in projects. And what they mean by bankable is that for the private investors, they do get something in return. Something I do want to mention, and which is worth noting, is that in the initial draft, so remember there was the draft and then there was the recommendation support, there was little substantive mention made of public finance outside of the idea of public-private partnerships and using state guarantees for private investment. In the updated recommendations report, the PCC acknowledges the critical role of public finance, but also says that this is constrained because at the moment government is cutting budgets. They do also say there are certain things that next steps that should be made and engagements with Treasury around this. But what is also worth mentioning is that despite the fact that there is mention made of the need for public finance, within the context of the JTFM itself, there's little scope and there's little mention made of how public finance can be brought into the JTFM. And I think this is something that civil society and communities must be aware of. Because at the moment, the people who, the institutions that are funding social protection, skills development, that is government, and money should at least potentially be coming from there to support the just transition and the financing mechanism of such. Next slide, please. So another key aspect of the JTFM, which I'll now speak to, is its potential setup. Because obviously the structure of the JTFM is very important to understand how exactly it will operate. So in developing the first draft of the JTFM, the authors, so Kritham, looked at 4 examples from across the world as to what a JTFM could look like. The 4 examples they looked at were India's District Minerals Foundation, the Kenyan Community Trust Fund, the European Union's Just Transition Mechanism, and Canada's Coal Transition Initiatives and Infrastructure Funds. What I want to mention is that the Indian and the Kenyan models are a lot more decentralized than the European and the Canadian models. So based on the assessment of these four examples, the JTFM document and recommendation support outlines the strengths and weaknesses of a centralized versus decentralized system. I just want to touch on this quickly because I do think this is something that civil society and community should keep in mind. What are the benefits of a centralized system versus a decentralized system? So for a centralized funding system, the strengths are that you have a high degree of coordination because it's centralized. You're able to have, it's easier to get policy alignment, and it is easier to use public funding mechanisms. The weaknesses, on the other hand, is that initiatives are often unable to account for local conditions because it's so centralized in one place. And there is also the possibility of misallocations of funds and high levels of corruption. On the decentralized side, the strengths are that you have local decision making. You can be more responsive because you're on the ground and you're localized. It also allows for greater community participation and simultaneously allows for innovation and experimentation because it is decentralized and based within localities. The weaknesses of a decentralized system, as outlined in the JTFM, are that you need to establish independent institutions in different localities. You also need to establish associated governance structures. It could be harder to secure adequate funding, and there needs to be significant coordination at the national level. With all of this in mind, the PCC considers a hybrid model built around a central at the institution the optimal approach currently. So in the JTFM recommendations report, they're saying a hybrid model built around the central institution is the optimal approach, and that is what they're recommending. In terms of the broader institutional options, the institutional options for the JTFM, and with the benchmarking as a guide, the PCC outlines 5 potential institutional options. Some of the factors that inform the options and their prioritization were who already fulfills the existing functions that are needed, with certain functional criteria that are important, being the ability to mobilize funds, the ability to plan, the ability to allocate funds, and the ability to provide technical assistance. In addition, some of the other factors that were considered were how quickly can this institution be established, does it have governance structures in place, and how accessible is it, and how does it align with the listed criteria. Based on this, 5 potential institutional structures are outlined. The first is a fully public sector entity. So this would be a new institution created. The second is an entity created in terms of the Public Services Act, which would allow for the creation of a government component within a particular government department. Third option was an entity created and managed within the control of an existing PFMA entity, so Public Finance Management entity, such as the Development Bank of South Africa, Industrial Development Corporation. The fourth option that was outlined in the report was a public-private partnership, and then finally, a fully private entity. So, although the PCC does not explicitly outline which option it prefers, it does suggest that at this stage, and given the urgency of the situation, the JTFM would be best suited within an existing development finance institution such as the IDC or the DBSA. Yeah. Next slide, please. So as I said, there's the draft report and then there's more recent recommendations report. In the more recent recommendations report, a timeline and priority areas for the establishment of the JTFM have been outlined. What I do want to add is, although they mention this timeline, there's very little detail provided within the report itself, and this is it. You won't find anything else in the recommendations report besides this. So very little detail on what the timeline is. But I'll just give you a basic outline of what's being said. So the PCC envisages 2 phases to the establishment of the JTFM. In the short to medium term, meaning a year and a half to 2 years, a more decentralized approach will be anchored on the just transition, on the JET-IP's public management unit's funding platform, with work to be undertaken within DFIs. As an immediate first step, obviously, as I said, it will be working with the funding management platform to provide matchmaking services and project preparation services. It will also begin supporting a collaborative process within existing development finance entities, such as the IDC and the DBSA. For this phase, the report also outlines key interventions to enable the future evolution of the JTFM. So this includes collaborating to identify structuring and blending barriers facing the pipeline of projects, developing a strategy for the mobilization of funds, and at the end of the 18 to 24 months, instituting a review process based on how things have unfolded until this stage. So this is the short to medium term timeline, if you want to call it that, for the JTFM functional areas. Next slide, please. So now that I've outlined what the latest PCC recommendations report on the JTFM consists of, I'll now outline some key critiques of the JTFM that we have identified. Firstly, when it comes to the scope and approach, one of the critiques we have of the JTFM is that it contributes to further fragmentation of the financing of the just transition. And what we mean by this is, what is happening in this country is that we're having a whole bunch of different mechanisms and institutions and plans being developed for the funding of the just transition mechanism, which is breaking something that should be systemic in approach into smaller pieces. We think that this fragmentation, this breaking down of the approach is not useful, because what we need is a systemic approach to the just transition, because it's a systemic issue that is an entire social, that affects all of society and all of the economy. This is illustrated in the fact that the JTFM has a project-based approach. So it's focusing on an individual project instead of a portfolio of projects. The danger in this is that it allows funders to pick and choose what they're going to fund. And the reason this is a danger is because justice elements can then be left behind, and funders are like, no, we want to fund that renewable energy project that will give us a return on investment, not social protection, etc. What the JTFM instead should be doing is help mainstream the just transition into the finance system as a whole in South Africa. Secondly, the role of public finance, and this is something I touched on already. There needs to be greater scope for public finance in supporting a just transition in South Africa. And while the JTFM speaks to this, or the JTFM recommendations report speaks to this, there are no details given on how this should take place. And it is clear that a lot more work needs to be done around this. The third sort of body of critique we have is that there needs to be greater clarity on how the justice element will be funded and what the timeline is for this. The reality is that communities are experiencing the impact of the transition as we speak now, and I don't need to tell the people in the room this. The timeline does not say when communities will be seeing financial support, and it does not speak in detail to how the justice element will be supported. And that is something that needs to be further understood, and is something that needs to be pushed on. Finally, it's unclear, there's a lack of clarity around stakeholder involvement and transparency. So what will the role be of civil society organizations in governance and oversight? The report does mention that a stakeholder engagement charter will be developed and published, but how will communities inform that charter, and how will it actually be practically applied? Transparency also remains an issue around the JTFM and the broader use of funding for the transition. In the JTFM recommendations report, there's no substantive detail on what steps will be taken to ensure transparency. Transparency is mentioned, but again, no details are provided, and this is something that needs to be unpacked and pushed on. I want to say this is important and critical because we've already seen problems with how just transition projects are funded, and we've seen this with the JTFM grants register. There's been quite a lot of controversy around the transparency on that and how projects are being funded. And again, I think it is critical for communities to understand how the money that is meant for them is being used and how it will potentially be used to support them. Next slide, please. However, despite these critiques that are outlined, there are elements of the JTFM that are valuable. Firstly, what the JTFM does emphasize is that there's a shared responsibility for a just transition. It emphasizes that achieving a just transition in South Africa is a collective responsibility and cannot be achieved without the involvement of all stakeholders in the country. Secondly, it brings to the fore the need for a just transition tagging framework, which will be crucial for the operation and supporting of a just transition in South Africa. What is critical, though, and it is something that is mentioned in the recommendation support, is that it needs to align with National Treasury's climate budget tagging efforts. One of the potential benefits of a JTFM is that it could serve as a central mechanism for pooling and allocating resources effectively. So I have now given a basic outline of what the JTFM is. Next slide, please. Thank you. I've also just listed some supplementary content that I would encourage any stakeholders who are engaging with the JTFM and the broader just transition financing space to read. We do have email links with Earthlife Africa, so if anybody needs anything, we'd be happy to share that with them. But this is our presentation, and thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. Betunasivila sabasaphinda nento beyigqoka ukujisa nosisi ngokusolindela ii-questions ezothi zivele ebantwini kuyo yonke le ayingoyitsho just transition financing and mechanism. Abantu abanemibuzo abafuna uqonda baphakamise izandla abazophendula imibuzo. Nkosini. Umuntu ofuna uqonda into angabuza bethunani aphakamise isandla kuyo yonke le nkcazelo is-affectayo thina abantu bangomama. Ngabazi khona izandla? Okay.
With the trillions that you just mentioned and hundreds of something trillion of dollars or rands, do you know perhaps how much is that out of that trillions is grants and how much are we going to be is loans? Was this dollars, because we know that as South Africa we in debt already. So I'm always triggered was how much is it going to be grants? How much do South Africa is supposed to be paying back? And two, is there a system that is in place that is going to guard or kind of, I would say, guard the money, because we know that South Africa is a corrupt country, that I can say without fear. So is there a system in place that is going to guard all that funds that is going to come through? And thirdly, is the funds that is going to, is it going to be solely used for the JT programs? Or is it also going to be, you know how the infrastructure is in South Africa, so is the funds that are going to come through solely being used for just JT? Thank you.
So on your question about the trillion, so in the JTIQ, just to clarify, it outlines that initially for the period 2023 to 2027 to support certain elements of the just transition, 1.48 trillion rand will be needed. That isn't money that is available. Of the money that has been committed by the international partner groups, 4% of that was initially going to be grants. That is slightly higher now, but still loans, concessional loans, which means loans that are not at the normal commercial bank rate, but are slightly lower. Concessional loans are the primary funding from the IPP partners, but grants, initially it was only 4%, just to answer that question. And that is not for the 1.48 trillion, but for the 98 billion that was committed by the international partners group. In terms of systems in place to ensure corruption, within the JTFM, as with most of these documents, it is mentioned that this needs to be put in place, and there is a small section outlining what can be done to do this. But again, the devil is in the details. What does that mean in practice? And the question is, who has oversight on those mechanisms and those policies and those institutions that will be governing this? I think that is a much more important question, because even within institutions in South Africa where corruption is prevalent, there are policies in place, but it's about the oversight, and that, I think, still needs to be clarified in relation to the JTFM. And I think that is something that civil society and communities are in a position to push for, about what the details are. Yeah, and I think, yeah.
All right, thank you, Tuna.
Can I also, Chantal?
Give this lady.
Yeah, Chantal.
Thank you. The one thing I wanted to just emphasize is that it's an idea, the Just Transition Finance Mechanism. It is not a fund. There is no money in it. And there is nothing in the short term that is actually very visible of how it's going to affect you and your lives. And it's something very important to remember, because I know sometimes these stakeholder consultations, it comes, it looks like everything's neatly wrapped up and it's nice and tidy. But the reality is the Just Transition Finance Mechanism, with all of the things we shared, is still just an idea and a concept being worked on. So what I would encourage you to do, because a lot of the ways in which projects are being developed from a Just Transition perspective is very much top-down. It's sitting in the rooms of, sometimes I say middle-class people in Joburg and other places where you're designing projects for communities. What we need more of in South Africa is for our communities to come together and say, this is what a project and a suite of projects would look like in our community. This is what we need, this is how we need the money, this is how it needs to come to us. And that's why one of the core work for Rabia is the dignity of this whole situation. Because the way financing is coming into our country for the justice elements of the transition is very, very undignified. Even in the, I can openly say now, I was involved with preparing the Just Transition Investment Plan at the presidency. And even at that level, you are owed the funding from the international community, but you have to beg for it. And you have to take on conditions that don't suit the things that you're concerned about. Most of it was loans, and most of what's standing in the future for South Africa is loans. And it's okay for renewable energy because it can generate an income. But the other thing you need to be very conscious of is, before these projects are implemented at community level, the first thing there needs to be is a social safety net. There needs to be social protection in place before these projects actually are set up. And we don't have that sequencing of ideas of projects now. So you must, if I can encourage you, you must think about what is the order in which things need to happen. And what does that need to look like? Because that determines access and how the money comes to you so that it benefits communities better. So thank you for giving me a short moment to share. Thanks.
Moreni, I think I'd just like to add to the researchers that just gave us a very beautiful presentation. Just to add a bit that I'm coming from the organization Ebizongoba Green Connection, and it's seven new communities as a Northern Cape close to the Namibian border, whereby a green hydrogen project is being developed. Abantu baluza imihlaba yabo. Beluza imihlaba yabo nje. This green hydrogen is being exported to Germany, and they are not going to benefit from it. So, ithi ke ngoku iphinde ize kwathina siluluntu kuba thina, how do we ensure, we fight to ensure that the government will include abantu kwezi processes and that abantu abasaleli emva, because awukwazi uba developer i-project eSouth Africa ithathwa imihlaba yabantu for uba developer le project but ishipwe to Germany. So ke ngoku ithi loo nto thina lithini ke ngoku lwathu uxanduva as abantu, and how do we ensure that government, these projects are a bottom-up approach, meaning that it leaves no one behind. It was just a comment that I wanted to make based on the presentation. Ingos.
I just want to make a comment. Thank you for a great presentation.
I also want to say thank you for clarifying that there's no money yet. Because when we hear trillions and billions and all those monies, we get excited because people are unemployed and people are living in extreme poverty. Thank you. We hope money will come in soon though.